Chapter 1 of the Book of This and That. Suspicion. Suspicion is a beast with 1,000 eyes, but most of them are blind, or colorblind, or askew, or rolling, or yellow. It is a beast with 1,000 ears, but most of them are like the ears of the deaf man in the comic recitation, who, when you say whiskers, hears solicitors, and when you are talking about the weather, thinks you are threatening to murder him. It is a beast with 1,000 tongues, and they are all slanderous. On the whole, it is the most loathsome monster outside the pages of the Fairy Queen. Just as the ugliest ape that ever was born is all the more repellent for being so like a man, so suspicion is all the more hideous because it is so close a caricature of the passion of truth. It is a leering perversion of that passion which sent Columbus looking for a lost continent and urged Galileo to turn his telescope on the heavens. Columbus may, in a sense, be said to have suspected that America was there, and Galileo suspected more than was good for his comfort about the conduct of the stars. But these were noble suspicions, leaps into the light. They are no more comparable to the suspicions which are becoming a feature of public life than the energies of an explorer of the South Pole are comparable to the energies of one of those private detectives who are paid to grub after evidence in divorce cases. One might put it a good deal more strongly, indeed, for the private detective may in his own way be an officer of truth and humanity, while the suspicious politician is the prophet only of party disreputableness. He is like the average suspicious husband, in the case of whom, even when his suspicions are true, one is inclined to sympathize with the wife for being married to so green-eyed a fool. Suspicion, take it all in all, is the most tedious and scrannel of the sins. It would be folly, of course, to suggest that there is no such thing as justifiable suspicion. If you see a man in a tube lift with his hand on some old gentleman's watch chain, you are justified in suspecting that his object is something less innocent than to persuade the old gentleman to become a Plymouth Brother. But the man of suspicious temperament is not content with cases of this sort. He is the sort of man who, if it were not for the law of libel, would suspect the Reverend F. B. Meyer of having stolen La Gioconda from the Louvre. His suspicions are like those of a man who would accost you in the street with the assertion that you had just murdered the President of the United States, or that you were hiding a stolen dreadnought in your pocket. Obviously, there would be no reply to a man like this, except that he was mad. He has got an idea into his head, and it is his idea, and not the proof or disproof that the idea has any justification, which seems to him to be the most important thing in the world. Suspicion, indeed, is a well-known form of mania. Husbands suspect their wives of trying to poison their beer. Friends suspect friends of planning the most extraordinary series of losses and humiliations for them. Nothing can happen but the suspicious man believes that somebody did it on purpose. He is like the savage, who cannot believe that his great-grandmother died without somebody having plotted it. Obviously, to believe things like this is to put poison in the air, and it is not surprising to learn that the savage goes out and murders the first man he meets for being his great-grandmother's murderer. In this manner, civilized man is little better than the savage. He knows a little more about the natural laws, and so he is not suspicious of quite the same things, but his suspicions, as soon as he begins to harbor them, swiftly strip off his civilization as a drunken man strips off his coat in order to fight in the street. He becomes Othello while the clock is striking. Straightway, all the world's his bolster. There is no creature on earth so innocent or so beautiful that he will not smother it in the insanity of his passion. Literature is to a great extent an indictment of suspicion. The Ring in the Book is an epic of suspicion, and the blot on the scutcheon is its tragedy. In the story of Paolo and Francesca, again we are made feel that the hideous thing was not the love of Paola and Francesca, but the murderous suspicion of Malatesta. In this case, it may be admitted, there was justice in the suspicion. But suspicion is so very loathsome a thing that, even when it is just, we like it as little as we like spying. All we can say in its favor is that it is more pitiable. Men do not go spying because there is a fury in their bosoms, but the suspicious man is one who is being eaten alive at the heart. He wears the mark of doom on his sullen brows as surely as Cain. For such a man the sun does not shine, and the stars are silver conspirators. He is a person who can suspect whole landscapes. He sees a countryside, not as an exciting pattern of meadow and river bend and hills and smoke among trees, but as an arrangement of 1,000 farms with fierce dogs eager for the calves of his legs. He can concentrate his affections on nothing beautiful. He can see only worms in buds. He can ultimately follow nothing with enthusiasm but will-o'-the-wisps. To go after these, he will leave wife and children and lands, and he will dance into the perils of the marshes, into sure drowning, a lost figure of derision or pity, according to your gentleness. Nor is it only in private life that suspicion is a light that leads men into bog-holes. Suspicion in public life is also a disaster among passions. Englishmen who realize this must have noticed with apprehension the growth of suspicion as a principle in recent years. Suspicion is the arch calumniator. That is why, of all weapons, it is most avoided by decent fighters. Every honorable man would rather be calumniated than a calumniator. Every sensible man, too, for calumny is the worst policy. It is clear that while the public men of a country are prepared to believe each other capable of anything, there can be no more national unity than in present-day Mexico, or than in Poland before the partition. It is the same with parties as with nations. The reason why revolutionary parties are so rarely successful is that the members suspect not only everybody else, but each other. The more revolutionary the party is, the more the members are inclined to regard each other not as potential Garibaldis, but potential traitors. For much the same reasons, criminal conspiracies seldom prosper. Crime seems to create an atmosphere of suspicion, and cooperation among men who doubt each other is impossible. But it is the same with every conspiracy, whether it is criminal or not. Secrecy seems to awaken all the nerves of suspicion, even when one is secret for the public good, and the conspirators soon find themselves believing the most ludicrous things. Who has not known committees on which some man or woman will not sit because of an idea that some other member is in the pay of Scotland Yard? The amusing part of the business is that this kind of thing goes on even in committees about the proceedings of which there is no need of secrecy at all, and at which reporters from the Times might be present for all the harm to man or beast that is discussed. But there is a tradition of suspicion in some movements that serves the purpose of enabling many innocent people to lead exciting lives. I once knew a man who spent half his time tying up his bootlaces under lampposts. He had an invincible belief that detectives followed him, and he was never content till he had allowed whoever was behind him to get past. Scotland Yard, I am confident, knew as little of him as it does of Wordsworth, but it was his folly to think otherwise, and for all I know he may be going on with those slow but sensational walks of his through the London streets at the present day. This is the amusing side of suspicion. Unfortunately, it has also its base and mirthless side. Practically every bloody mistake, I use the word not as an oath, in the French Revolution was a result of suspicion. It began with suspicion of the Girondins, but suspicion of Danton and Robespierre soon followed. Suspicion is a monster that devours her own children. Manifestly, no movement can succeed in which men believe that their friends are viler than their enemies. But in every movement there are men who make a trade of suspecting the leaders in their own camp, and the socialist movement is as much exposed to the plague as any other. Suspicion of this kind, I think, is a bitter form of egoism. It is a trampling of the suspected persons under one's own white feet. Nor is it only in movements and in nations that suspicion plays havoc. International suspicion is a no less costly visitor. We live in a world in which every cup of tea we drink and every pipe of tobacco we smoke pays toll to this ancient and gluttonous dragon. Every year each country sets up huge altars of men and ships and guns to the beast, but he is not satisfied. He demands universal power, and insists that we shall give all our goods to him, except just enough to keep ourselves alive, and that we shall not shrink even from offering up human sacrifices at a nod of his head. Perhaps some day a new St. George will arise and release us from so shameful a subjection. Common sense seems to have as little force against him as an ordinary foot soldier against Goliath. We feel the need of some miraculous personage to put an end to our distress. Meanwhile, one may hail as prophetic the continual organization of new knighthoods for the suppression of the dragon. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of the Book of This and That, on Good Resolutions. There is too little respect paid to the good resolutions which are so popular a feature of the new year. We laugh at the man who is always turning over a new leaf as though he were the last word in absurdity, and we even invent proverbs to discourage him, such as that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. This makes life extremely difficult for the well-meaning. It robs many of us of the very last of our little store of virtue. Our virtue we have hitherto put almost entirely into our resolutions. To ask us to put it into our actions instead is like asking a man who has for years devoted his genius to literature to switch it off onto marine biology. Nature, unfortunately, has not made us sufficiently accommodating for these rapid changes. She has appointed to each of us his own small plot, has made one of us a poet, another an economist, another a politician, one of us good at making plans, another good at putting them into execution. One feels justified, then, in claiming for the maker of good resolutions a place in the sun. Good resolutions are too delightful a form of morality to be allowed to disappear from a world in which so much of morality is dismal. They are morality at its dawn, morality fresh and untarnished and full of song. They are golden anticipations of the day's work, anticipations of which, alas, the day's work too often proves unworthy. Work, says Emile somewhere, is vulgarized thought. Work, I prefer to say, is vulgarized good resolutions. There are no doubt some people whose resolutions are so natively mediocre that it is no trouble in the world to put them into practice. Promise and performance are in such cases as like as a pair of twins. Both are contemptible, but as for those of us whose promises are apt to be Himalayan, how can one expect the little pack mule of performance to climb to such pathless and giddy heights? Are not the Himalayas in themselves a sufficiently inspiring spectacle? All the more inspiring, indeed, if some peak still remains unscaled, mysterious. But resolutions of this magnitude belong rather to the region of daydreams. They take one back to one's childhood, when one longed to win the football cup for one's school team, and, if possible, to have one's leg broken just as one scored the decisive try. Considering that one did not play football, this may surely be regarded as a noble example of an impossible ideal. It has the inaccessibility of a star rather than of a mountain peak. As one grows older, one's resolutions become earthier. They are concerned with such things as giving up tobacco, taking exercise, answering letters, chewing one's food properly, going to bed before midnight, getting up before noon. This may seem a mean list enough, but there is wonderful comfort to be got out of even a modest good resolution, so long as it refers not to the next 5 minutes, but to tomorrow, or next week, or next month, or next year, or the year after. How vivid, how beautiful tomorrow seems, with our lordly regiment of good resolutions ready to descend upon it as upon a city seen afar off for the first time. Every day lies before us as wonderful as London lay before Blücher on the night when he exclaimed, "My God, what a city to loot!" Our life is gorgeous with tomorrows. It is all tomorrows. Good resolutions might be described, in the words in which a cabinet minister once described journalism, as the intelligent anticipation of events. They are, however, the intelligent anticipation of events which do not take place. They are the April of virtue with no September following. On the other hand, there is much to be said for putting a good resolution into effect now and then. There is a brief introductory period in most human conduct, before the novelty is worn off, when doing things is almost, if not quite, as pleasant as thinking about them. Thus, if you make a resolve to get up at 7 o'clock every day during the year 1915, you should do it on at least one morning. If you do, you will feel so surprised with the world, and so content with your own part in it, that you will decide to get up at 7 every morning for the rest of your life. But do not be rash. Getting up early, if you do it seldom enough, is an intoxicating experience. But before long, the intoxication fades, and only the habit is left. It was not the elder brother with his habits, but the prodigal with his occasional recurrence into virtue, for whom the fatted calf was killed. Even for the prodigal, when once he had settled down to orderly habits, the supply of the fatted calves from his father's farm was bound before long to come to an end. There are, however, other good resolutions in which it is not so easy to experiment for a single morning. If you resolve to learn German, for instance, there would be very little intoxication to be got out of a single sitting face to face with a German grammar. Similarly, the inventors of systems of exercise for keeping the townsmen in condition all stress the fact that, in order to attain health, one must go on toiling morning after morning at their wretched punchings and twistings and kickings till the end of time. This is an unfair advantage to take of the ordinary maker of good resolutions. He is enticed into the adventure of trying a new thing only to discover that he cannot be said to have tried it until he has tried it on 1,000 occasions. Most of us, it may be said at once, are not to be enticed into such matters higher than our knees. We may go so far as to buy the latest book on health or the latest mechanical apparatus to hang on the wall, but soon they become little more than decorations for our rooms. That pair of immense dumbbells which we got in our boyhood, when we believed that the heavier the dumbbell, the more magnificently would our biceps swell, who would think of taking them from their dusty corner now? Then there was that pair of wooden dumbbells, light as wind, which we tried for a while on hearing that heavy dumbbells were a snare and only hardened the muscles without strengthening them. They lie now where the woodlouse may eat them if it has so lowly an appetite. But our good resolutions did really array themselves in colors when the first of the exercises was invented. There was a thrill in those first mornings when we rose a little earlier than usual and expected to find an inch added to our chest measurement before breakfast. That is always the characteristic of good resolutions. They are founded on a belief in the possibility of performing miracles. If we could swell visibly as a result of a single half-hour's tug at weights and wires, we would all desert our morning sleep for our exerciser with a will. But the faith that believes in miracles is an easy sort of faith. The faith that goes on believing in the final excellence, though one day shows no obvious advance on another, is the more enviable genius. It is, perhaps, the rarest thing in the world, and all the good resolutions ever made, if placed end to end, would not make so much as an inch of it. One man I knew who had faith of this kind. He used to practice strengthening his will every evening by buying almonds and raisins or some sort of sweet thing, and sitting down before them by the hour without touching them. And frequently, so he told me, he would repeat over to himself a passage which Poe quotes at the top of one of his stories. The Fall of the House of Usher, was it not? Beginning, "Great are the mysteries of the will." I envied him his philosophic grimness. I should never have been able to resist the almonds and raisins. But that incantation from Poe, was not that, too, but a desperate clutching after the miraculous? There is nothing which men desire more fervently than this mighty will. It may be the most selfish or unselfish of desires. We may long for it for its own sake or for the sake of some purpose which means more to us than praise. We are eager to escape from that continuous humiliation of the promises we have made to ourselves and broken. It is all very well to talk about being baffled to fight better, but that implies a will on the heroic scale. Most of us, as we see our resolutions fly out into the sun, only to fall with broken wings before they have more than begun their journey, are inclined at times to relapse into despair. On the other hand, nature is prodigal, and in nothing so much as good resolutions. In spite of the experience of half a lifetime of failure, we can still draw upon her for these with the excitement of faith in our hearts. Perhaps there is some instinct for perfection in us, which thus makes us deny our past and stride off into the future, forgetful of our chains. It is the first step that counts, says the proverb. Alas, we know that that is the step that nearly everybody can take. It is when we are about to take the steps that follow that our ankle feels the drag of old habit. For even those of us who are richest in good resolutions are the creatures of habit, just as the baldly virtuous are. The only difference is that we are the slaves of old habits, while they are the masters of new ones. On the whole, then, we cannot do better as the new year approaches than resolve to go out once more in quest of the white flower which has already been allowed to fade too long, where Tennyson placed it, in the late Prince Consort's buttonhole. End of Chapter 2.
The Book of This and That, Chapter 3, The Sin of Dancing. It is a pleasure to see a modern clergyman expressing his horror of the dancing of the moment, as Canon Newbolt did in St. Paul's. One had begun to fear lately that the clergy were trying to run a race of tolerance with the dramatic critics and the nuts. On the whole, I prefer clergymen in the denouncing mood. They are there to remind us that the soul does not pour out its riches in ragtime songs, that Peter is not to be bribed with trinkets, and that the gates of heaven will not, so far as is known, open to the bark of a toy dog. They are there, in a sentence, as the shaven critics of the saltatory world. The history of civilization might be interpreted with some reason as a prolonged conflict between the preachers and the dancers. The preacher and the dancer may both be necessary to us, like east and west in a map, but we feel that, like east and west, they should keep their distance from each other in censorious reconcilement. I know, of course, that the modern anthropologist is inclined to insist upon the kinship between dancing and religion. We are told that the church was born not, it may be, under a dancing star, but at any rate under a dancing savage. The theory is that man originally expressed his deepest emotions about food, love, and war in dances. In the course of time, the leaping groups felt the need of a leader, and gradually the leader of the dance evolved into a hero, or representative of the group soul, and from that he afterwards swelled into a god. This, we are asked to believe, is the lineage of Zeus. The theory strikes me as being too simple to be true. It is like an attempt to spell a long word with a single letter. At the same time, it gains color from the fact that the heads of the church have continually shown a tendency to dancing since the days of King David. We have it on good authority that in the Latin church the bishops were called praesules because they led the dances in the church choir on feast days. It is a fact of some significance, indeed, that at more than one period of history it has been the heretics rather than the orthodox who have raged most furiously against dancing. The Albigenses and the Waldenses are both examples of this. Superficially, this may seem to weaken my contention that preaching and dancing can no more become friends than the lion and the unicorn. But if you reflect for a moment, you will see that it is the heretics rather than the orthodox who are, of all men, the most given to preaching. Bishops preach as a matter of duty. Savonarola and Mr. Shaw preach for the religious pleasure of it. So rare a thing it is to find an orthodox clergyman of standing doing anything that deserves the name of preaching. And by preaching, I mean protesting in capable words against the subordination of life to luxury, that, whenever he does so, the newspapers put it on their posters among the great events, like a scandal about a cabinet minister or an earthquake. It is not difficult to see why the preachers have usually been so doubtful about the dancers. It is simply that dancing is, for the most part, a rhythmical pantomime of sex. It is the most haremish of pastimes. One is not surprised to learn that Henry VIII was the most expert of royal dancers. He was an enthusiast for the kissing dances of his day. Indeed, even before he had abandoned his youthful straightness for the moral code of a farmyard that had gone off its head. I can imagine how a preacher with his craft at his fingers' ends could deduce Henry's downfall from those first delicate trippings. Even the Encyclopedia Britannica is driven to admit the presence of the amorous element in dancing. Actual contact of the partners, it insists, is quite intelligible as a matter of pure dancing, for, apart altogether from the pleasure of the embrace, the harmony of the double rotation adds very much to the enjoyment. But that reference to the pleasure of the embrace is fatal to the sentence. How are we simple people as we whirl in the waltz to know whether it is the pleasure of the embrace or the harmony of the double rotation that is making us glow so? The preachers will certainly not give us the benefit of the doubt. They will follow the lead of Byron, who, in his horror at the popularization of the waltz, declared that Terpsichore was henceforth the least a Vestal Virgin of the nine. Many people will remember the letter which Byron prefaced to the waltz over the significance of Horace Horneman, supposed to be a country gentleman from the Midlands. Describing his sensations on first seeing his wife waltzing, Mr. Hornham says, "Judge of my surprise to see poor Mrs. Horneman with her arms half round the loins of a huge, hussar-looking gentleman I never set eyes on before, and his, to say truth, rather more than half round her waist, turning round and round and round to a damned seesaw, up and down sort of tune, that reminded me of the Black Joke." Cynics explain Byron's attitude to dancing as a matter of envy, since he himself was too lame to waltz. At the same time, I fancy that an anthropologist from Mars, if he visited the earth, would take the same view of the drama of the waltz as Byron did. I do not mean to say that the waltz cannot be danced in a sublime innocence. It can, and often is. But the point is that sex is the arch musician of it, and whether you approve of waltzing or disapprove of it will depend upon whether, like the preachers, you regard sex as Ahula and Ahuloiba, or, like the poets, as April and the Song of the Stars. It is worth remembering in this connection that a great preacher like Huxley took much the same view of poetry that Byron took of dancing. Most of it, he said, seemed to him to be little more than sensual caterwauling. Tolstoy, if I am not mistaken, interpreted Romeo and Juliet in the same spirit. This kind of analysis, whether it is just foolish, always shocks the crowd, which can never admit the existence of the senses without blushing for them. Confirmed in its sentimentalism, and therefore given to harping on the sensual string, it swears that it finds the Russian ballet more edifying than church, and would have no objection to seeing the Merry Widow waltz introduced into a mothers' meeting. There is nothing in which we are such hypocrites as our pleasures. That is why some of us like the preachers. Even if they are grossly inhuman in wanting to take our amusements away from us, they at least insist that we shall submit them to a realistic analysis. In this, they are excellent servants of the scientific spirit. What, then, is a reasonable attitude to adopt toward sex and dancing? Obviously, we cannot abolish sex, even if we wish to do so, and if we try to chain it up, it will merely become crabbed like a dog. On the other hand, there is all the difference in the world between putting a dog on a chain and encouraging it to go mad and bite half the parish. There is nearly as wide a distance separating the courtly dances of the 18th century from the cakewalk and the Apache dance from the Irish reel. Priests, I know, in whom the gift of preaching has turned sour, have been as severe on innocent as on furious dances. But this is merely an exaggeration of the prevailing sense of mankind that sex is a wild animal and most difficult to tame into a fireside pet. It is upon the civilization of this animal, none the less, though not upon the butchering of it, that the decencies of the world depend. And this is exercise for a hero, for the animal in question has a desperate tendency to revert to type. One noticed how its eye bulged with the memory of African forests when the cakewalk affronted the sun a few years ago. The cakewalk, I admit, seemed a right and rapturous thing enough when it was danced by those in whose veins was the recent blood of Africa. But when young gentlemen began to introduce it as a figure in the Lancers and suburban black parlors, one resented it, not merely as an emasculated parody, but as an act of dishonest innocence. But everywhere it has been the tendency of dancing in recent years to become more noisily sexual. I am not thinking of the dancing and undress, which for a time captured the music halls. That is almost the least sexual dancing we have had. The dancing of Isadora Duncan was of good report as a painting by old Sir Joshua. We may pass over the Russian ballet, too, because of the art which often raised it to beauty, though it is interesting to speculate what St. Bernard would have thought of Nijinsky. But as for ragtime, it is a silly madness, a business for maenads of both sexes, and all those gesticulations of the human frame known as bunny hugs, turkey trots, and the rest of it are condemned by their very names as tolerable only in menagerie. On the other hand, because the bunny and man and the turkey and woman have revived themselves with such impudence, are we to get out our guns against all dancing? Far from it. One is not going to sacrifice the flowering grace of Genet or Pavlova, with her genius of the butterflies, because of the multitude of fools. All we can do is insist upon the recognition of the fact that dancing may be good or bad, as eggs are good or bad. And to remind the world that in dancing, as in eggs, freshness is even more beautiful than decadence. Perhaps some of the performances of the Russian ballet would come off limping from such a test. Opinions will differ about that. In any case, one cannot help the logic of one's belief. Each of us, no doubt, contains something of the preacher and something of the dancer, and our enthusiasms depend upon which of the two is dominant in us. Meanwhile, we are likely to go on preaching against our dancing, and dancing against our preaching, till the end of time. That merely proves the completeness of our humanity. It makes for balance, like, as I have said, east and west in a map. That, surely, is a conclusion which ought to satisfy everybody. End of Chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of the Book of This and That. Thoughts at a Tango Tea. It is not easy to decide what is the dullest feature in the tango teas, upon which Londoners are now wasting their afternoons and their silver. The most disconcertingly tedious part of the whole entertainment is, in my opinion, the tango itself. It is mere virtuoso work in dancing, an eccentric caper, not after beauty, but after variety. But the rest of the program has no compensating liveliness. The songs are sad affairs, even for a music hall, and the band, with its continual selections dropped into every available hole in the afternoon's amusement, gets on the nerves like a tune played over and over again. And then, to crown everything, comes the parade of mannequins wearing the latest fashions in women's dress, or what will be the latest fashions in another month or two. On the whole, I think this part of the show must be given the prize for inanity. The tango is bad, and the tea varies, but this milliner's business, it is more than dull. It is an outrage on human intelligence. Students of society cannot afford to leave unnoticed this new development in the taste of the upper and middle classes. It seems to me to represent almost the extreme limit in the evolution of the English theater. The actor-managers have often in recent years turned Shakespeare into a dress parade, but here is the dress parade with Shakespeare left out. Musical comedies, hundreds of them, have been as amazing as fireworks with their wonder of costumes, and here is the wonder of costumes without any alloy of musical comedy. Nor are these costumes flashed upon you with a coarse insolence. Slowly and separately each girl appears, sometimes from the back of the stalls, sometimes from the back of the stage, and marches before your vision, as obtrusive as an advertisement, while the band plays some tune like "You Made Me Love You." One should not say marches, perhaps, but glides. The glide seems to be the ideal at which the modern woman aims in her walk, and the mannequin glides with every exaggeration. But if you have ever seen cows ambling along a country road, you have seen something strangely like the glide that is now in fashion. Yet no one thinks of speaking of cows as gliding. The mannequins come before us, one by one, at this slow cattle walk, and pass along one of those Reinhardt pathways above the heads of the people in the stalls. Then they raise their arms and turn round, as in the showroom, and smile as in the advertisement of a toothwash. and so on till 10 or a dozen of them have appeared and disappeared. Then out glides the whole school of them again, not singly this time, but in a procession, all smiling under their barbaric panaches and their towering crest of feathers, and one of them with her head and chin wrapped in gilt embroideries that make her look like a queen with a toothache. All smiles and paint, the girls nevertheless seem to have no more relation to their gowns than a statue to the hat which someone has perched on its head. They give us no drama of dress. They are simply lay figures imitating the colors of the rainbow. Perhaps, to a student of fashion, they have some meaning and interest, but a student of fashion does not go for his lessons to a music hall. To the rest of us, they are simply a trash of fine clothes. They are a decadent substitute for gladiatorial exhibitions. They are a last wild, no, not wild, a last tame parody on life. Life as a parade of mannequins. The satiric imagination could invent nothing more contemptuously comic. Perhaps, in the theater of the future, the characters of the plays will remain as mannequins, while the words will be left out as superfluous. Hamlet will appear in his inky cloak at the right intervals, turn round so as to give us a good back and front view, and Ophelia will then take his place in a procession of fine dresses, the whole play being a solemn in and out movement of silent gowned figures. Shakespeare ought to be much more popular that way. Even Shakespeare on the cinematograph could hardly compete with it. What one wonders is the cause of all this mannequinism. Is it a survival of the passion for dolls? Or is it a case of woman's flying to a refuge after man has ousted her from all her old busy pleasures? Scarcely anything but the dress interest is left to her. Woman, at least the kind of woman whom one sees at tango teas, no longer bakes, or weaves, or spins, or makes medicines, or even sews as her grandmothers, or to be quite accurate, her grandmothers did. She has gradually been led to hand over her baking to the baker, her medicines to the chemist, her weaving and spinning to the mills. What could Penelope herself do in such circumstances? Without her loom, there would have been nothing for her but to think out fresh ways of arranging her hair and to disguise herself endlessly in new draperies, which would have led to her being pestered more than ever by the suitors. Idleness, it does not take a Sunday school teacher to see, is the universal dressmaker, and a woman who is not allowed to work and does not drink and has not even a vote is driven among the mannequins as surely as if you force her there by law. After all, if one has nothing to do, one must do something. One must put one's virtue into hats and stockings if one is not allowed to practice it more soberly. It may be, of course, that the mannequin stage, which the women of the comfortable classes have now reached, is really a step towards a more sober dignity. Woman had to be released from the old servitude of the house, from the predestined making of beds and sewing of clothes and cooking of dinners, in order to assert her equal capacities with those of the man who rode to war and cozened his fellows in the city and sat on committees and stayed out till all hours. She may not have realized at the time that it was merely an escape from one drudgery to another, from the drudgery of housework to the drudgery of pleasure, but she cannot take her brains with her into a music hall matinee without realizing it now. And she is learning to hate the one as much as the other. Feminism is woman's great protest against the drudgery of pleasure. Some of the feminists, it may be granted, turn it into a claim to share with man all those old pleasures with which man's eyes have long been yellow and weary. But the spectacle of the middle-aged male followers of the life of pleasure in any restaurant or theater ought to terrify these bold ladies from maintaining such a demand. The supreme philosophers of pleasure, from Epicurus to Stevenson, have all had to turn to hard work and virtue as the only forms of amusement which did not spoil the bloom of one's cheek. Even the supreme philosopher of clothes would have kept us far too busy ever to think about them. People unfortunately have got it into their heads, as the result of a long process of civilization, that in order to be beautiful, clothes must be a kind of finery to which one gives the thoughts of one's nights and days. And the result is that most women would rather take the advice of their dressmaker than of Epicurus. It is one of the most ludicrous misdirections that the human race has ever followed. The dressmaker's living depends on her keeping off Epicurus with one hand and the 12 apostles with the other, and she has certainly done so with the most brilliant efficiency. We who do not live by dressmaking, however, should be coolly critical of the dressmaker's point of view. It was not she, perhaps, who invented, but it is she who most brazenly keeps alive the great delusion of civilized society that woman's foolish dresses are more beautiful than the reasonable clothes of men. In 15,000 years or so, when the idea of beauty will have had time to develop into a tiny bud, men and supermen will laugh at this old absurdity. The idea that modern men's clothes are ugly is a deception chiefly maintained by advertisement agents and shopkeepers. There is, I admit, much to be said against the bowler hat. But the jacket, the trousers, and the sock, so long as it does not match the tie, come nearer what is excellent and appropriate in dress than any other costume that has been invented since the strong, silent Englishman left his coat of paint behind him in the wood. It is possible, no doubt, to spoil the effect of it all with too much folding and pressing. Dandyism means the ruin of one's clothes from the aesthetic point of view. One must be ready to expose them to all weathers, to have them rained upon and rumpled, if one wants them to be really beautiful, say like an old church. It is because woman's dress, at its finest, does not stand this test of beauty that a Marchioness is worse clad than the driver of a coal cart or a chimney sweep. Not luxury, but necessity is the creator of beauty. Beauty comes from our submission to nature. It is not a matter of thieving a few handfuls of colored feathers from nature's breasts and wings. It comes by accident, as you will see if you look down from a hill at night on a gas-lit town. Almost the only kind of lights which are not beautiful are those which are deliberately so. One has to go out of the streets among the lights of the white city in order to see beauty giving way to prettiness. Similarly, one might say that the only kind of dresses which are not beautiful are those which are deliberately so. Even among the poor, there is more grace to be found among mill girls in their shawls than when on Sundays they dress themselves up to look as like their dream of riches as possible. I hope that the dress parades in the West End theaters and music halls will sooner or later be transferred to the poorer districts. They may not at once kill envy and the respect for wealth. They may not strike people as being so ridiculous as they really are, though anyone who finds amusement in waxworks ought to get sufficient entertainment from a dress parade. But if the show has not this effect, it may at least open the eyes of the poor to the barbarous conditions in which the rich live and fire them with the determination to hurry to the rescue and release them from the gilded cage of their luxuries. The beginning of the social revolution, I foresee, will be a rising against the mannequins. It will be an infinitely greater event in history than the taking of the Bastille. End of chapter 4.